Back on December 21st, the Hawks found themselves in a shootout against the Bulls. After just 3 quarters, the two teams had scored a combined 231 points. But it was the last 5 minutes that would ultimately decide the game. Chicago had the ball up 4 and set up their offense in a way that forced Trae to be the low man. He's so worried about the primary action that he doesn't see his man sneak baseline, even starting to recover to a non-existent player. Giddey recognizes this and skips it cross court, prompting an X out from Jalen Johnson, and the result is a great look on a catch and shoot 3. Then, not even 20 seconds later, Jones is the one initiating. Okongwu's gonna jump out to the ball after a screen, leaving Vooch in the middle of the floor with a 4-on-3 advantage as he finds Kobe White for another triple. So the Hawks made a conscious effort to hide Trae. The Bulls are getting ready to bring Jones up to the ball in hopes of getting Trae on Giddey. Alexander Walker makes a great read, scramming Trae out of the play with a pre-switch. Only that leaves him on an island with White, which is just as big of a mismatch. From there, they clear that side of the floor, let him go to work one-on-one, and the result is a wide open layup. After a quick score on the other end, Alexander Walker meets White with full court pressure in hopes of stalling the offense. But when Okoro comes up to set a high ball screen and makes great contact, now they're right back to Trae attempting to defend in isolation. It doesn't take much for Kobe to get around his hip, and Trae's last resort is to attempt to draw an offensive foul, which doesn't go his way. That takes us to the final minute and a half. Once again, you're going to see Nikhil execute a pre-switch in hopes of hiding Trae from the ball. So instead of screening, Jones just runs through, clearing space for White to screen, and just like that, they've got Trae on Giddey. Dyson has to chase the ball to prevent a mismatch, forcing the entire defense into rotation, and after a few extra passes, it ends up right back in Giddey's hands for a wide open 3. In a matter of about 3 minutes, the Bulls scored 13 points by attacking Trae. They ended the game with 152 points in regulation. Of course, that requires hot shooting, among other variables, but this wasn't an isolated incident. 3 days before that, the Hornets made a deliberate effort to go at Trae every single time down the court and scored 133. About a week after that, the Heat did the same. They scored 126. And the very next night, it was New York's turn, as they scored 128 to give Atlanta their 6th straight loss. Over the entire season, Trae has only played in 10 games. The Hawks had the 3rd worst defense in the NBA during those games, allowing 122 points every 100 possessions. And in the 28 games he missed, they only allowed 115, which is right around the league average. Naturally, they went over 500 during those 28 games without Trae, and just 2-8 with him in the lineup, which raises a number of questions. Is it possible for a single player to damage a defense this much? Have the negatives started to outweigh the positives in his game? And did it make sense for Washington to pull the trigger on a trade? Throughout NBA history, we've seen plenty of great offensive players who couldn't hold their own defensively. And whenever a team was built around one of those weaker defenders, especially small guards, defensive scheming was about keeping them away from the ball as much as possible. For decades, offenses often consisted of 1 or 2 non-factors or stationary spot-up shooters, which meant that if you put your weakest link on them, it could negate most of their deficiencies in their individual defense. Some guys even found ways to add value in these spots. Allen Iverson was aggressive in passing lanes, which helped him lead the league in steals 3 times. Steve Nash always knew how to put his body in the right spot at the right time, which helped him draw a ton of charges. Fast forward to 2026, and it's basically become impossible to hide a defender for a number of reasons. Firstly, the floor for offensive talent has gotten unbelievably high. Instead of the 4th or 5th guy on most teams being a non-threat, now almost every rotation player in the league can shoot, dribble, and pass. Against the Bulls, Trae spent a bunch of time matched up with Modest Buzelis, a 6'8" athletic forward who can create downhill. Against the Knicks, he had to guard Mikal Bridges, who can legitimately score from all 3 levels while setting up teammates for high-quality shots. And against the Hornets, to avoid positional awkwardness, they tried putting him on LaMelo Ball, and I'm sure you can imagine how that worked out. Even more prominent than the rise in offensive talent, though, has been the rise in offensive strategy. It's gotten to a point where even if a weak defender is able to find a competent matchup, they're going to be brought into the action every single play. Think about last year's Eastern Conference Finals matchup. The Knicks were built around 2 weak defenders in Brunson and Cat, so the Pacers made a deliberate effort to put either one or both of them into basically every action. Thibodeau had to go to drastic measures just to get stops, like constantly switching up the coverages, trying all sorts of different lineups, at times even closing some games with one of their stars on the bench. From a league-wide perspective though, guard-to-guard screening action has become a staple, allowing offenses to either create advantages early in the clock or get a quick mismatch. When it came to the Hawks in particular, it didn't matter who they were playing, this immediately became their opponent's go-to. When Trae's man sets a ball screen, he's such a uniquely limited defender that there's pretty much nothing he can do. do. Going back to the Knicks for a second, a big part of the reason why they were able to make it out of round 2 against the Celtics was their late game defensive execution. Boston made a conscious effort to hunt for Brunson every single time down the stretch, and New York decided to switch every screen, trust him to hold his own, and he did a lot better than you'd expect from a small guard for one reason: strength. He's got a super sturdy base and low center of gravity, so Tatum and Brown weren't able to just easily bully their way to the paint. Compare that to Trae, who's all of 164 pounds soaking wet and simply incapable of holding his ground against basically anyone in the league. Combined with the fact that he's 6'2" on a good day, has short arms, isn't quick laterally, and can't get up vertically, he's simply a one-on-one mismatch in basically every situation. As a result, anytime he found himself matched up with any sort of shot creator, Atlanta's entire defense had to shift in order to protect the paint, meaning they were automatically playing at a disadvantage. It didn't even have to be a superstar. Just someone who's capable of putting the ball in the court and scoring in the paint could compromise Atlanta's entire defensive infrastructure, which meant they were constantly playing in rotation. It's the same thing when Trae gets hit with a ball screen. Despite the skinny frame, he can't dodge screens at all. His big man has to help early, meaning the low man has to slide to the paint, and once again, the entire defense is compromised from the moment his guy touches the ball. Funny enough, a signature move of his is to smack the screen hard and fall, hoping for an offensive foul. Then if he doesn't get it, there's little effort to get back in the play, just sort of floating around and letting his team rock in a 4-on-5 situation while he hopes for the best. Even in the rare event he does get around a screen though, he doesn't have the length or agility to stay attached, so you'll continue to see him sort of float behind the play while the big man attempts to erase a 2-on-1 advantage. Essentially, the Hawks' entire defense was built around not letting offenses get to that point. They had to keep Trae away from the ball, but when he's getting put in action over and over and over again, that means his execution has to be literally perfect. Needless to say, it isn't. Generally, he's looking to hedge, but his positioning isn't great and he's got shockingly bad hands for a small guard. So the hedge is usually just a formality. Not to mention, there's a consistent theme where he and his teammates just don't seem to communicate, often leading to plays where there's a weird mixture between a switch and a hedge, resulting in a red carpet to the basket and more of those team defensive breakdowns. Just like when he was on the ball, the Hawks were playing at a constant disadvantage as soon as he was forced into the primary action, and there was nothing they could do to hide him. With all of that said though, when I talk about how offenses have figured out how to attack weak links, I didn't just mean in the primary action. Another way you'll see offenses exploit weak points within a defense is through court alignment. As I mentioned earlier, Trae's small, doesn't have any length, and can't get up vertically. So you'll see offenses intentionally move him to the weak side corner or the dunker, knowing that if he helps at the rim, he's a non-factor. This wouldn't be as much of a problem if he was sharp with his rotations or intentional with his movements. But for the most part, he's real spacey. At times, it seems like he doesn't understand basic team defensive principles, floating around out of position, missing simple closeouts, or just outright being lazy. Some of it is a lack of willingness to buy in, getting caught watching the ball, not making any second efforts, not boxing out and letting his man grab second chance opportunities, but there's also a clear lack of processing. For all of the vision and anticipation on offense, he just doesn't seem to read the floor well defensively, which is what prevents him from getting some of that value back as a defensive playmaker. At the very least, with guys like Luka or Harden, you could count on them to jump lanes, eat up space, deflect passes, and force turnovers. Trae doesn't do that. Most of the time, when he does take a gamble, it's completely out of place and results in the offense gaining a clear advantage. When you stack together everything I've talked about, the culmination is just a uniquely bad defensive signal. Even if it doesn't seem like he plays a direct role in the team giving up a quality shot, he almost always does. Maybe it's a missed rotation, a late closeout, or maybe it's something more obvious like getting beat off the dribble. We've seen poor defenders who bleed value. There are plenty in the league today, but almost all of them have some redeeming quality. Maybe they've got good hands, maybe they're vertical, maybe they draw charges or help in the glass or make timely rotations. Trae's a rare breed of defender who doesn't have a single redeeming quality. He's simply bad in every way, and that shows up in the numbers. Opponents shoot better from 2 and 3 when he's on the court. They get to the rim more and shoot better there. They turn the ball over less. They grab more offensive rebounds. And as a result, they score significantly more points. Over the last 5 seasons, Atlanta had a defensive rating of about 119 during his minutes and 115 with him on the bench. That would be the difference between being a bottom 2 defense in the league or about an average one. That's not to say Trae's the only reason Atlanta had a weak defense. It's just that he did nothing to help and was at the center of most of their problems. There's a clear difference when he's not out there, as the team can start to switch, not help as aggressively, and avoid constant rotations. We've known this for his entire career though. The question has never been whether or not he's a good defender, it's been whether or not the offensive skill set makes up for it. Trae's been a one-man offense since about halfway through his rookie season, and almost all of his value comes from 4 key traits. First is the pull-up shooting threat. Between a quick release, serious range, and sheer audacity, defenses have had to respect him from as far as 30 feet out. Then he pairs that with 2 other traits, an elite handle and a strong in-between game to get into the defense and apply pressure inside the arc. Between that and the pull-up jumper, he can create his own shot just about whenever he wants. Then the piece that pulls it all together is his all-time great passing. The perfect complement to his volume scoring game, as he'd gift wrap dunks and corner threes to his teammates. These 4 traits turned him into a pick and roll maestro. If his defender got hit by a screen, it felt like there wasn't much a defense could do to stop the Hawks from getting a good shot. For that reason, they'd put the ball in his hands 90, 100 times a game and just run pick and roll over and over and over again, which turned them into a walking top 10 offense. Within that particular structure, he had MVP type of offensive impact. At the turn of the decade, the average regular season defense was still running lots of drop coverage. There wasn't much intentional scheming and teams weren't nearly as aggressive, so Trae knew exactly which reads to make on a play-by-play basis, essentially operating on autopilot. Think about the 2021 playoffs for a second. In the first round, they matched up with the Knicks, who with a center rotation of Taj Gibson and Nerlens Noel found themselves playing tons of drop. Then it was the Sixers in round 2, who with Embiid essentially only ever ran drop. Finally, in the conference finals, it was Mike Budenholzer, Brook Lopez, and the Bucks, who notoriously refused to do anything but drop. In each round, you get these huge Trae performances because none of those defenses forced him to play out of structure. It was essentially a continuation of the regular season, only with more intensity. And while operating on autopilot, he's just a 30-10 machine. What happened in the 2022 playoffs though? For the first time ever, a defense forced Trae to play out of structure. Miami showed drop coverage. They also switched, hedged, blitzed. Every ball screen came with a new curveball, meaning that he couldn't predetermine his reads. Instead, he had to be a problem solver. But with Miami's combination of size, length, and super aggressive help in the gaps, those solutions often came in the form of a rushed shot or pass. Through 5 games, he ended up averaging just 15 points and 6 assists. He turned the ball over even more than that, with splits of 32% from the field, 18% from 3, and 46% true shooting, while Atlanta's offense put up a disastrous 102 offensive rating. Obviously, there are other factors that go into this performance like poor shooting luck and not much help from the rest of his team. But the Heat sort of laid the foundation for what it looks like to shut him down. And now in 2026, the entire league has caught up on these concepts. You'll basically never see a defense stick to deep drop coverage against him. Instead, they're mixing it up with switching, hedging, sometimes a higher drop, and they're sending help to the gaps to shrink the floor. But it goes even further than that. His primary defenders have gotten bigger, stronger, and longer as smaller players have slowly gotten replaced. Ball pressure has become a big trend, and when met with length 50 feet away from the basket, once again, it's a lot harder to play within that structure that made him such an offensive machine. So a lot of the things that popped up in that Miami series are what we see today on a game-by-game basis. And that's just natural progression in the NBA. Defenses start to figure out your approach, and you find new ways to counter. The problem is that Trae hasn't progressed at all. Actually, he started to regress in a few of those key traits. And during that time, offenses have only become more efficient. So what's happened is that instead of being a guy who could score at an efficiency that was 2 or 3% better than league average, now he's consistently falling below that mark, which makes it a lot harder to build a team where he's a primary scoring option. This is a serious roster limitation for 2 reasons. One is that we've already talked about how it takes basically perfect defensive coverage to make it work with Trae on the court, so one of those defenders also has to be a capable lead scorer. 2 is that he doesn't have any semblance of an off-ball game, meaning that his playstyle sort of forces the offense to run through him. Of course, that means his teams have to run a heavy diet of pick and rolls, which just doesn't yield the same value that it did 5 years ago. Again, looking at the last 5 seasons, the Hawks were about 3.5 points better on offense with Trae on the court, which would be the difference between a top 3 offense and about an average one. But remember, the defense was about 3.5 points worse, so we're talking about a team that was either a top offense and bottom defense or average at both. Essentially, it didn't matter if the Hawks had Trae on the court or not. They were the same, slightly below average team for half a decade. decade. That applied to entire games with and without Trae as well. After he became an all-star in his second season, Atlanta won less than 47% of the games where he was available, and they went a perfect 500, 45-45 without him. That's not to say he's a negative or even neutral impact player. Even with defenses having a better understanding of how to slow him down, the playmaking drives a ton of offensive value, and he's still able to hit great heights as a scorer when the jumper's falling. It's just that when the limitations start to pile on in the way they have, what we're looking at simply isn't the signal of a franchise cornerstone or true championship caliber building block. For that reason, I think he'd be best suited in more of a specialized role, but under his current contract, that might not even be an option. Back in 2021, he signed a 5-year, $215 million rookie max extension, meaning he's making an average of $43 million a year, with a $48 million player option coming up this summer. I'm sure that's a big part of why the Hawks decided to move on, but that's also why it makes sense for the Wizards. They've got a ton of cap space, developing young players, and a few intriguing defensive pieces. They can afford to give Trae his touches, assess the fit, and renegotiate, and he can help elevate off-ball talent. A guy like Alex Sarr can reach new heights as a pick-and-roll big. Keyshawn George as an off-wing and secondary creator. Trae Johnson as a dynamic shooting threat. He's far from perfect, but he's still one of the very best creators in the game, and as long as he's got that superpower, he can provide a serious boost.